I will end with that, and I am happy to turn over the time to Superintendent Dr. Sydnee Dickson.
Wow, thank you, Representative Moss. I just, I feel like you just heard my campaign manager, and I'm not running for office, so thank you. I have such love and admiration for Representative Moss as a friend and my representative, and she truly embodies everything I would want to be as a representative and listens to her constituents. I'll just share an anecdote that my husband sent his first constituent letter to her, and he was frustrated by the possibility of a particular bill file that had been open, and he was tracking it, and he it wasn't one of hers, but he sent a letter and she wrote him right back without influence from me, and he was so excited that she took the time to be so personal. So Carol walks her talk, and I really appreciate all of you. I want to give a shout out, and if you, this is definitely a reaction button moment, to all of the educators and school board members on this call. As people were introducing themselves in my congressional district, Congressional District 3, and then I saw the faces pop up of people I know. There's so many invested in education in their daily work or elected officials on school boards. So thank you so much to everybody. I'm going to just share my slide deck, and let's see. Mitchell, I think you've disabled my screen. So if you can put me back on being able to share. Otherwise, I'm going to be a very boring talking head.
It should be working if you.
Okay, got it now. Thanks so much. Okay. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep, coming through.
All right, great. Having a hard time seeing my screen. All right, let's do it this way. All right, so everybody sees the screen.
I think we're seeing your Google. There you go. It's working now.
Okay. All right, so I've been given the topic that certainly based on some of your introductions, I feel pressure to make sure that everybody walks away feeling really good about what's going to happen in the fall. But, you know, the virus isn't predictable, and a lot of things aren't predictable. But I also want to say that think about the system we're walking back into. So it's the unpredictability of where we're at with the virus. It's also teachers and leaders walking back in to talk about racial injustices. And then many families have faced hardships through an economic downturn. So those are three really big, heavy lifts for our educators in our communities as we return to school. So I put that out there, even though we're going to be talking about the return to school through COVID, there are those other two elements that are really impacting our schools. When we went into a soft closure last spring, I remember standing there in a press conference and everybody talking about what was happening with this new virus. And I said, you know, we're going to stay the course with schools for a bit. I'd met with Dr. Dunn and others and talked to the governor, and we felt like maybe we could just stay the course for a week or two. Well, within that, and that was the end of the session. So remember that on a Thursday, the session ends, and we were so excited about record funding for education, $403 million in new money, and we passed some amazing policies, and we were all so excited. And then within 24 hours, we had bad news that the spread was such that we felt like we had to close a lot of things down. So on Friday, when I was just trying to celebrate and so excited about our session, Governor Herbert called me and said, I need you up here in an hour. We're going to announce the soft closure of schools. So I went from a high to a quick low. And so we got together as a team and worked with educators to think about what do we really need to address. So it was the immediacy of the soft closure and trying to work in this new now. People were calling it the new normal, and nothing felt normal. We then, at the same time, were thinking about what summer would look like, and knowing that there would likely be learning loss, how we would bridge some of those gaps into this near future. And now we're not only in that space, but also thinking about our new future and returning to school safely, but also taking an opportunity to reimagine what schools might look like so that they're more personalized for each of our students. The essential 5 that we addressed in the spring were really trying to make sure that learning was going on. And I will say, I could spend a lot of time on this, but I want to say that based on legislation we had about 4 or 5 years ago on digital teaching and learning, it really did put us ahead in that we had more one-to-one devices in our state. We were more connected, and yet about 30% of our students really didn't have the broadband that they needed. So that, I'll talk about that in a minute, but that definitely is something that we need to continue to tackle. We also needed to make sure that our seniors were able to graduate on time and ready to transition to their next phase. And thinking about the opportunities for our students to be fed, and I'll show you a few data points on that in a minute. We wanted to make sure that our classified employees could stay in the system and receive their benefits and find gainful work. And we were able to do that. We had bus drivers delivering meals and painting buildings. We had paraeducators making phone calls home to families. So people found ways to stay engaged. And then last but not least, really trying to support our students and staff with mental health and social emotional needs. I love the teachers that would do mindful moments with their students through Zoom, some yoga, or a lot of social emotional work, but there's still a lot to be done. So after we looked at those 5, well, I do want to talk about meals. I want you to notice how many meals we jumped to just from April to May. And we tend to serve around 7 million meals anyway through school lunch, but suddenly students who might have been bringing lunches to school were taking advantage, and we had a meal map. So if you couldn't find a meal at your school, or your school for some reason wasn't serving, you could find a meal. If you're in a charter school and you might drive 30 minutes to get to your charter school, you could go to your nearby district school and get a meal. So we try to make sure that every student was served. We had to work hard with the federal government to get some waivers. For example, there's a rule that you cannot hand a student breakfast and lunch at the same time. And so think about people having to come to the school and pick up breakfast and then coming back for lunch. So we were able to get that waived. Another rule from the federal government is that as a parent couldn't pick up the meal, the child had to physically touch the meal. And so we were able to get that waived. So that was a lot of work just to make sure that we really could feed our kiddos. Another issue was really trying to ascertain the social emotional impact of being out of school. And we sent out a survey, Safe School Survey, to our principals. We had a response rate of about 220. So that was a good response rate. And you can see some of the things that they were very concerned about in terms of risk factors and returning. So anxiety and social isolation, stress, depression, financial stress, those are there at the top. But some of the things that we really couldn't determine that we're very concerned about were the fewer reports to the child abuse hotline. And yet we know the stress and students being at home, we're making assumptions that some of those things were exacerbated by the situation. So we know that as our students come back in the fall, that's one of the things that we'll want to work on and have plans to work on, really trying to assess where they're at with their mental health as well. Here's some things we learned from remote learning, or our soft closure. And again, as I mentioned, we were ahead of the curve. My colleagues in other states were calling me and saying, in Arizona, for example, I need 11,500 Chromebooks or laptops just for Tucson alone. Well, we already had that covered. Broadband was our bigger issue. And it was taking other states 2 and 3 weeks to get geared up. Our teachers are heroes. Without any warning, on a weekend with 2 days to go, they flipped on a dime to try and do things for students, whether it was copying packets and writing lesson plans, but they were just amazing given the lack of time that they had to plan and prepare. And our parents suddenly had to turn into teachers. So the lessons that we learned around that is that we really need to do a better job of getting broadband into every home. It really, it shone there was a spotlight shown on, that was really inappropriate grammar. Let me try that again, teacher Spackman Moss. There's an issue of equity in that what was highlighted became very apparent during this, and that was the lack of technology in our homes in broadband. So we were able to work with broadband companies, but you might be a family who was on a waiting list, and it would take 6 weeks for them to come to your home. Well, there's a month and a half of school, even if you were getting free or reduced broadband. So my new mantra is broadband is an essential utility. And until we think of it that way, we won't be able to close those equity gaps. Another issue is additional professional learning, and our teachers are really been leaning in this summer to engage in better quality preparation for remote learning, because we may find ourselves in that situation again, and you'll see a bunch of blended models. And then we've got to do a better job of helping our parents know how to work through the technology and making sure that they're that trifecta between school and the teacher and home. So we're going to determine where they're at academically, socially, and emotionally. And as we figure out what they need, then we'll move forward based on those needs. And that's no small feat for our education systems. I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and children, because you'll see whether people are using a political or a scientific frame. You'll hear them say, well, this isn't that big of a deal for children. So some will say, why can't we just put them back in school and have everything back to normal, because they're not carrying the virus like we thought. They don't get affected like we thought. So here's the scientific and health data behind it. Yes, we know that it infects children less frequently than adults. And when they get it, it does tend to be less severe unless they have underlying symptoms. Oftentimes they might have stomach issues, or they might not have a fever, and they have different symptoms sometimes than our adults. So we might mistake it for something else. A majority of the cases in our student population are in that young adolescent. This says 15 to 17, and that's where the bulk of the cases are, but we're really seeing an increase in the 14 to 18-year-olds. And we know that students who are already compromised and are already suffering, we just really need to be ultra mindful of them, because they're more susceptible to anything, right? So we have this issue of testing as well, because our students who aren't showing symptoms aren't tested. Then the prevalence of asymptomatic children and pre-symptomatic cases, they're just not well understood. We don't have a lot of longitudinal data in this space. So the national data, and this was from February to April, I'm sure this would change now, but the statistics on children were around 2% in the nation at that time. And 77% of the children who were hospitalized and or died had underlying conditions. When we look at Utah, we can see at the end of June, so this was June 27th, 5 to 11-year-olds, there were 618 cases, and we did have one death that we know was related to COVID, but also underlying conditions. You can see the 12 to 13-year-olds, but notice the 14 to 18-year-olds. And if we go back into the data, we know that this is continuing to spike. All you have to do is go over to my local high school, Olympus High School parking lot, where Representative Moss and I walk once in a while. And you will see Mardi Gras in the parking lot at times, with kids playing and hanging on each other in large groups. And so it's not a surprise that we're seeing a spike in cases. So rather than do what some states have done, and that's write these 80-page manuals that give detailed information, and then they're finding they have to change those week by week, we're taking a little bit different approach. Now, certainly there are requirements and recommendations that we put out into our schools, but we also want our parents, our students, and particularly our school personnel to really understand the characteristics of the virus. So we're teaching people what it is, how it behaves, and then looking at these characteristics to help us make decisions at local schools. Every classroom, every school has its own unique set of circumstances. So if we focus on these characteristics, it can help us mitigate the spread of the virus. So first we look at movement, and we think about risk with movement. So with all of these characteristics, we're thinking high risk, low risk. So with movement, there are some spaces where we can control the movement and some where we can't. I would compare an elementary setting to a high school. I've worked in both settings. As an elementary teacher or principal, you can teach kids to line up and space apart and walk down to the library, the cafeteria, to another classroom outside. It's a little bit easier to control their movement. When the bell rings in a secondary school, it's a little bit more mayhem like. So definitely less controlled. Kids shouting, yelling, grabbing, hugging, and moving en masse from place to place. I did visit a school where they had a song playing, and when the song ended, you need to be in your classroom, and kids were sort of skipping and dancing. That was fun to see. But nonetheless, it's harder to contain movement at the secondary level or in certain situations. When we talk about duration, the health period of time right now is 15 minutes. So if you are around somebody or in a group for 15 minutes, even if you are not masked up, but you're distancing apart, if it's longer than 15 minutes, then you think about what goes into the air. So duration is really important as well. For proximity, we talk about 6 feet, and that's become the standard across the globe of thinking about if you are closer than 6 feet together, then you're more likely to accept the contagion. Group size is important. Now, a lot of people say, let's just do what they've done in other countries like Denmark or Sweden, or, well, that's great when you start out with 15 to 20 students in a classroom. It's much easier to divide them up and spread desks apart so that you're 6 feet apart. But in the case of our Utah schools, where we have so many students, doing things like blended models where some are learning online at home, some are in school, split schedules. There aren't a lot of ways that you can spread the desks apart unless you are in some rural communities. So in our urban and suburban and even some of our rural communities where they have large class sizes, then it's a scheduling issue. And the second and third level effects of a scheduling issue is also thinking about working parents and conditions at home that make it more difficult for some of these remote and times at home for remote learning. Respiratory output, we've talked about this before, and that's where masks come into play. And so then you think about classes like choir, band, PE, all of those things have to take into consideration. Can we do it safely outside? Can you still hold a choir class, for example, but maybe do it in an auditorium where kids are spaced much farther than 6 feet apart with the teacher on the stage? In regards to touch, our little kiddos touch everything, but we also have to think about hygiene now as part of the procedures that we teach. And so it might be something like the procedure when a student comes into the classroom in the morning, they get their Chromebook or whatever it is, and they wipe it off. They have to become part of the cleaning routine, cleaning off keyboards as they leave. Our custodians are going to be wiping down more frequently door handles and light switches and, you know, all the things that have frequency of touch. And then we have to think about congestion. So that means that we're now more mindful about how and where students enter the building and exit the building. Recess at the elementary level, I talked to a little kiddo, a little second grader, who was very sad that he couldn't have recess. Well, that would be an awful thing to not let kids go outside. In fact, it would be detrimental to their well-being. But you can stagger recesses so that you don't have everybody going out at once, going out the door at once. So it's those congested places that you have to think about. So having these characteristics in mind, let's look through a couple of scenarios. So let's take transportation. Our Board of Education early on said we're going to require masks on buses. Now they had a conversation, and a motion was made and a vote was taken about masks for all. That motion failed, but they did look at these characteristics and said, you know, it's pretty critical that students wear masks on buses. And let's talk about why. So if we use those characteristics and we think about movement, lower risk and higher risk, well, students getting on and off a bus, you can actually spread them out a little bit easier as they get off a bus. But there's this space that the bus driver can't really control and contain until they're on the bus. Most students are on the bus for longer than 15 minutes. So that's where mask wearing comes into play. And proximity. If you are in a rural setting, sometimes on a special education bus with a few students, but most buses are packed full. We don't have the money or the time to run a number of routes. And I have been on rural bus routes where students are on the bus for an hour. You don't have the opportunity to pick up and return. Everybody is picked up along the way. So that means kind of one bus route. And therefore, what can you do? Well, a mask can mitigate some of that. And then with touch, the risk can be high or low, but we know that we're going to have to clean and spray the buses as students leave after each route, because they've been touching the seats and touching each other and who knows what else. And then again, just thinking of the risk about congestion of all the students being there together. So that's a scenario where you have to think about what can you do to mitigate this. So you can space having kids get on and off the bus, meaning that they're not all jammed in there together as they enter and exit. You can talk to them about what they touch. You can talk to them about not yelling. So these are things that you can monitor, but a mask is the best way to mitigate that with some of these risk factors. Let's talk about large group gatherings. Some have said we're not going to do assemblies. Well, they can still be done, but maybe they need to be done in a virtual way, or a class can come down and spread out in the auditorium. The assembly might run 4 or 5 times a day rather than one time where you bring everybody to the auditorium with students spread out. So these are the ways that we're asking people to think through scenarios using risk mitigation of low and high risk and the descriptors of the virus. We've asked each district and charter to come up with a plan that is a requirement by the board. And we're telling them the what needs to be addressed in the plan. So it's things like hygiene and activities and classroom structures and cleaning and remote. Again, we're trying to ensure that each system thinks about a way to personalize learning for students. So some might be able to come face-to-face, but if there's a compromised student or a family member who might have compromised immune systems, they're more vulnerable, they may need to stay home. So providing families with opportunities for remote learning, face-to-face and blended, that's what we're starting to see in the plans. And then again, gosh, if everyone would do their part, wouldn't it be great that we start school with a lower risk factor? But if we're like we are in Salt Lake right now with a moderate risk, then we'll need to see more remote opportunities for students, if not all. So we're telling them via a template what they need to plan for, but we're not telling them how to do it. This is where context comes into play. So based on what they need to assess and then mitigate based on the risk in their setting, that's where they'll develop their plans. And these plans need to be very transparent and very public. We've seen a variety. The teachers on the call can tell you that sometimes they are the last to be included and the last to know about the plans. And that's something that I've been a little bit disappointed about, that we haven't had more teacher voice and more understanding from the community about what they're doing. Now, in some places, I will say some charters and districts, they've done a great job of surveying the communities and publishing those surveys and having very open and public conversations about it. But at the end of the day, there will be published transparent plans that will come to the board. And when they come to the board on August 1st, they will need to have been posted on, voted on in the local board meeting, because local boards really should have this control, and then just posted on their local site. As a state board, we will not approve the plans. If we see something missing, we can provide technical assistance to help them, but it's really up to the local boards to approve these. And we have tools that we've downloaded. We have a website that's great. You can see it on the bottom, schools.utah.gov coronavirus. There are a lot of resources there. We have a reopening planning handbook, and we've been having these webinars to learn all that we know about the virus and what can be done. And it includes a panel of teachers and leaders. And those were recorded on our website, so they can be watched at any time. And then you can see the details in the handbook, the things that we're working on, the guiding principles that I've shown you, the communication, training, and specifically I want to call out equity. That is so important. Any plan that doesn't address equity is not a good plan, because we have to think about those who are the most vulnerable already for academic failure, and whatever that circumstance they find themselves in. Our students with disabilities are particularly vulnerable, students learning English, families living in poverty, and we really need to do what we can to lean in and make sure that their needs are met. So these are all of the things that we're working on in this handbook, and we continue to roll out resources. As of yesterday, we were rolling out another resource and working with local health departments, because the governor came out with his mandate on masks. And so we worked on the executive order that should be out this weekend or on Monday that gives more detail to that, where exemptions can be and what does that really mean, as well as working with the local health department to talk about what do you do when someone is, when somebody tests positive, what does quarantine look like? So all of those details are in place, and we'll add those to this handbook and on our website. So that's a lot.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Superintendent Dickson, my name's Jill Fellow. I've been moderating the chat for you, and we have a few questions as we wrap up. We had a few questions about counseling services and how that has been managed during virtual time during the summer, and if and what attention has been made to counseling services in the reopening. That's our first question.
Yeah, Jill, that's a great question, and it's an important question. I have a COVID-19 advisory group, and then I have various advisory groups, and counselors and school psychologists sit on that group, and they've been providing a lot of resources for their counselors. They did so in the soft closure and have been doing so in the summer, and they're spending a lot of time reaching out to students and families, especially those families that we would say went dark. That's a term just to say we couldn't find them. I'll give you an example of Granger High School, one of our largest high schools, one of our most diverse high schools. And I believe it was by May, around April or May, they counted about 700 students who had gone dark. They just couldn't make contact. So that was through email, texting, phone calls. They had no response from the family or the student. And by mid-May, the counselors, teachers, paraeducators, they had done drive-bys, knocked doors, done everything they could. And they found all of those students with the exception of one and got them re-engaged. In terms of the social emotional work that we've done, I know that I'll give a shout out to Murray District. They are spending early fall working with their teachers, social workers, and counselors on issues of addressing racial injustice and becoming a more culturally responsive district. So they're spending time on that, as well as all of the work that they've been doing on social emotional learning. And counselors and social workers have really leaned in. The legislature has been good to really start focusing on mental health, especially in our schools. So we've had more money for counselors, and that was not cut in the budget cut. And by counselors, I mean mental health workers. So Zoom calls, class meetings, mindfulness, morning mindfulness, circles of talk and sharing. But we know come fall, we're going to unpack and uncover a lot of work that needs to be done. Thanks for that question, whoever asked it.
Thank you. We also see a series of questions in the chat relating to masks, shields, plexiglass, specifically around enforcement of masks. If children just don't wear it, what are the recommendations from the state on that sort of enforcement policies, as well as how there was a few things with shields opposed to masks. And then what about schools that have tables instead of desks? Is there plexiglass options there?
Yeah, great question. So we did receive CARES Act funding, and some of it came directly to us under the moniker of ESSER, and some was called GEAR funding that came to the governor, and the governor put all of that in K-12. And then higher ed had their own fund, and all of that could be used from the start of when President Trump declared a national emergency around this, which I think was March 13th. So anything going forward from that date that created was impacted by COVID, funds can be used for that. So what we see the use of those funds for are building shields, kind of the plexiglass like you see when you go into a restaurant. We're now seeing those in front offices for related services like speech pathology. Obviously, students need to see and hear their student, and face shields, clear face shields would be more appropriate. If it's a small office, plexiglass shield is coming down. So we're starting to see a lot of that as a use of those funds. We also have 10% of the money that we've kept aside, and we're supplying masks, shills, wipes, hand sanitizer, a lot of those kinds of things, protective gear that can be added to health kits, thermometers. So your schools are receiving a lot of that so you can spend money on other things. But in terms of being able to mitigate masks, I think that's where those options come into play of remote and blended and face-to-face, and that will have to be worked out local to local. You know, I think that's very tricky. We need to educate people. This is one of the things I have found in talking to so many people about masks. And again, it's very political, as you all know, but there are circumstances where it won't be conducive for students to wear masks. So those exemptions would be things like autism is a perfect example,
Right.
Spectrum Academy with a lot of students with autism, or if a student already has respiratory issues. So each school, that's why looking at all those factors, they kind of have to figure out what works for them. And those exemptions will be put into the order, but then schools will have to work within their setting. Maybe there is a county or a school where there's absolutely no spread, and you look at the risk of the virus and you focus more on distancing because you have the ability to do that. So going back to that misnomer that we're trying to protect our educators. It's not about students being prevented from getting it if they're wearing a mask, but educating people, it's to prevent others from getting it. So this is really about our educators as well. And there are a variety of ways that I think we'll be able to see students being able to take their masks off and when they put them on.
Right. Thank you so much. We so appreciate the time. We have more and more questions going in the chat. We'd love for you to hang out, maybe take some time to chat, looking at those questions while we move on to some of our other activities today. But this
Yeah, thanks everybody. I apologize for taking so much time. It's such
we
a big
appreciate
issue.
it.
So
Thank you.
I'll hang out in the chat and then I'll have to say goodbye because I've got a virtual funeral I need to attend. So
Oh, that's awful. I'm so sorry to hear that. Robin, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Superintendent Dickson. That was fabulous. And thank you, Jill. I don't think I've had an opportunity to really give Jill and Mitch, who's not here right now, but Mitchell Weiss, the credit they deserve for pulling this off for us today. So thank you both so much. You can give them a hand if you want to. I am going to turn the mic at this time over to Jeff Merchant. I know I don't need to introduce him. He